Okay, guys. I thought I'd just give you the stuff for this week. We'll get through it. That way we can keep going with this and get done with our class by the holidays. So, anyway, I'm going to go through our book and hope you guys had a good weekend. I will see you guys Sunday night. But so the Moment of Truth book is what I want to go over real quick. There is probably more we can go over when we get together, but basically the whole point of the Moment of Truth is that the sermon itself doesn't actually exist outside of the 25-30 minutes that it takes to actually preach it. That's when a sermon becomes a sermon. Everything we've done so far is sermon preparation. And there's a lot more to sermon preparation, time-wise, than there is in the sermon delivery. But the idea is that you can write out the entire sermon into a manuscript, and that's not a sermon, that's a sermon manuscript. It's in that moment. And there's a lot going on in the moment of preaching that makes the sermon. Your presence, their presence, your demeanor, and your voice inflection and the way you handle it. So not everything that you prepare to say in a sermon actually gets said, and sometimes you end up adding other things, and the mood of the audience, how you feel, all of those things play into the factor, and that's what he's saying is the moment of truth. Like on page 2, he says, the moment of truth is the occasion when the sermon lives. It comes forth from the mouth of the preacher and takes shape in the mind of the hearer. The dynamism of dialogue is present. The audience reads the preacher, his tone of voice, his facial expressions, the movements, his energy and animation, and every signal blends with his word to create a message. It's where everything that you have prepared combine. The thought that you've put into what the message is going to say, the logos, all of your life leading up to it, your ethos comes together in the moment where you express your pathos, and they read it. And of course, so much of what people pick up has to do with your body language and them reading you, your personality, and who you are. So there's a lot goes into this. So we're going to go through, so chapter 1 is God's plan for preaching. There isn't a whole lot more to say here except that what he's doing in this chapter is he's just talking about how important preaching is. There are a lot of ways that you can go about trying to communicate God's word or the gospel to people. The only way that God has actually expressly said that he's going to bless it is through preaching. So, missiology, evangelism, church growth, they come up with all kinds of things. And there's a million things you can do. You can do your trunk or treats, you can do your outreach programs, your block parties, all of these things, and they're all fine. And you might end up having a conversation that leads to something else in those things. You may have a conversation with somebody where you get talking to them about their life or God or the Bible or something like that, and it leads to something else. But the way that God has designed things is that primarily the word goes forth, the kingdom expands through the preaching. And so he says, in the noisy, murmuring world of today, in which everyone talks incessantly about everything, the preacher does well to remember that it was out of the silence that God spoke. And basically saying that we speak because God speaks. And anyway, he talks about a few different things in here, just how powerful the word is. A lot of these things are things that you already know, so I'm preaching to the choir. It's the power of the word, it's the power of the spoken word, and then the spiritual power that goes along with that. all comes together in the preaching to make it do the work of God. There's a book here I have, Preaching and Preachers by Martin Lloyd-Jones, in which it's pretty interesting. He goes through all of the different parts of preaching. It's a typical preaching book, and he comes to the very end and he talks about the demonstration of the power of the Spirit and of the power, and basically says, all your preparation, all of the work you put into preaching, if the Spirit is not in it, it's not going to accomplish anything. And so he says, he has this line, he says, with all thy getting, get unction. Unction means anointing from the Spirit. And the idea is that if the Spirit is in it and you have really prayed through this sermon preparation and prayed for that time and you are walking in the Spirit, and when you get up there, when you're going to preach and the Spirit is in you and working, you can deliver a message that really isn't all that exciting. If somebody were to look back at it, you may not say anything super insightful, but when the Spirit goes to work, people's hearts are changed. So sometimes people will read the sermons of George Whitefield. George Whitefield was the main evangelist for the Great Awakening, and they'll say his sermons really didn't have all that much to them, but he was so Spirit-filled that he would preach and people would respond. Anyway, there's this point here where Martin Lloyd-Jones is talking, and he says, he talks about receiving the Spirit, and he says, I can't remember exactly where he says it, but he says, you can go through and do all kinds of other things. He says, there's all kinds of ideas. Guys try things all the time, whether you're doing some new outreach program, or you think, we're going to change the music, or we're going to do something, and that's going to be the thing that will be the new silver bullet that will work. And he says, go ahead and do all of those things, but just know that in the end, you're going to wear yourself out, and you're going to come back, and you're going to say, the only thing that really works, and the only thing that God has promised to bless, is Spirit-empowered preaching, which is something good for us to remember. It's nice to nitpick yourself about your presentation and stuff like that, but ultimately, if people aren't listening, if people aren't responding in faith, it may have to do with little things that you're doing, but a lot of times it's just that the Spirit's not in it. So he talks about a lot of that, and he has a good thing here in which he talks about the definition of preaching, which he goes through into great detail. I personally prefer the one he goes into in the next chapter, where he talks about preaching as truth through personality. So, to have a definition of preaching that goes that far, on the top of page 20, that's a lot of definition. Chapter 2 is on the person of the preacher. He talks about this book by a guy named Philip Brooks. So I actually have the book. It's called Lectures on Preaching by Philip Brooks. Interesting thing about that book is that in one of the opening chapters, he says that one of the concerns of his day was that preaching was going to be replaced through printed books. It seems so silly now, but at the time, printed books were really popular. And today you have YouTube, and you have Instagram, and you have TikTok, and all of these things that can make 10-second videos, which is about the length of time a person pays attention to one thing. And here we are advocating for 25, 30-minute sermons, and yet, preaching still keeps on going. All the different threats that we've had with TV, radio, internet, all of these things, preaching still keeps on going because it is the way that God has designed. So he says, most of chapter 2 is just focusing on yourself. It's that ethos part of preaching. It's who you are. So there's an old cliche that says something like, who you are is speaking so loudly, I cannot understand what you say. And that's to say, you can stand up and you can say everything correct, everything you say is true, but if the people in the pew do not perceive you as a person who they can trust, they don't listen to anything you say. They perceive you to either be a liar or someone who is a hypocrite or something, whatever. And so a part of preaching, other than preparing the message, is focusing on who you are and how you come across. So he says, from the viewpoint of communication, it is obvious that the preacher himself has tremendous impact on whether the message is received. The power of oral communication and the impact of nonverbal communication will make that clear. Listen to churchgoers talk about preaching, and you will quickly realize that the preacher's personality has at least as much impact on the hearers as the content of his message. It just is the way it is. I was talking to one of our teenagers years ago, and we somehow got talking about how you dress and even just how well you take care of yourself. And I told him, I said, if you will dress nice and you'll take good care of your body, people will treat you better. And he acted like that was really an offensive thing for me to say. And I said, it just is the way it is. The average person does not have a lot of time to make a judgment about you. And so they take the immediate cues that they can. I've tried to explain this to a lot of boys, or even young men who I try to tell them how women perceive them. If a woman's walking down the street and on a sidewalk, and the man who's coming towards her, if he looks threatening, she will either turn the other direction or she'll cross the street. If a woman is going into the parking lot, she will not park next to a vehicle that looks threatening. She doesn't have a lot of time to decide. Now, the person who's driving that old vehicle might be a saint, but she doesn't have a lot of time to decide. So she has to make decisions quickly about what she can do and who she can trust. And people figure that out. A person who looks trustworthy, a person who looks intelligent, a person who looks confident or non-threatening, all of those things make more of an impact on your hearers than you realize. Whether or not you can laugh, whether or not you're comfortable being in front of everybody, all of those things make a big impact on how they receive your message. And it's all part of your personality. It's not to say that you have to, I'm not trying to say that you have to be something you're not. A lot of your personality is God-given. And you use that. That's what, God's truth has to come through your personality. And it's kind of like different strokes for different folks. You all probably have your favorite preachers, and they could be totally different. A John Piper is very, very different than a John MacArthur, who's very, very different than a Tim Keller. And they all have their own personality and their own style, and it all works. You just have to understand the impact of your personality on the hearers. So he talks about this tension between balancing truth and personality. And he says you don't want to get imbalanced on one or the other. To be imbalanced, say, if you were heavy on truth and low on personality, everything you're saying is true and it's great. And if a person who is just there, if he doesn't care about you and he just wants to hear, the news, he's going to listen. It's like if you go into a doctor's office and you're waiting to hear results back on some tests that have been done, you don't really care so much about the personality of the doctor. You just want to hear what the results are. On the other hand, there are other instances in which the personality of the person who you're dealing with matters a lot. And so you're balancing those two. Too heavy on personality, you make the sermon too much about yourself. Too heavy on truth, you don't engage with the audience. And so there's a balance there that he's talking about. And so on pages 26 and 27, he talks about living with that tension of trying to balance those two things. He goes into a few other things that you just have to be aware of. So for instance, your speech patterns, if you talk with a Southern accent, if you, like one of the things I do is when I go back and watch myself, one of the things I notice is that I talk really slow and I put pauses in my sentences where there shouldn't be pauses. And I find that very irritating when I go back and listen to it. I don't do a very good job of correcting it, which you can, now that I'm saying it, you're hearing me pause in the middle of my sentence. And anyway, I hope you don't find it irritating. I do. But he says, you know, those are all part of your speech pattern. He says your family and church background make a difference. You know, if you're coming out of, you know, a no church background, if you're coming out of more of a strict church background, such as Catholic or Lutheran, or, you know, if you're coming more of a, you know, you're kind of folksy Baptist or charismatic, all of those things are going to influence the way that you come about it. It's also going to influence the way that you preach. The style that you heard preaching growing up is you're either going to mimic it or you're going to reject it altogether. The style that you're listening to now is going to affect the way that you do it. He says your family background even will have an impact on those things. He talks about a philosophy of ministry. Your philosophy of ministry is basically in your mind, whether you can articulate it or not. It's the things that you think work and the things that you think don't work. The things that you should think you should do, the things that you think you shouldn't do. All of these things, you know, it's just, so much of it is about who you are and what you do. And some of these things take time to build. If you are preaching the first time at a church, you know, like Brandon, you're going to be going to a lot of new churches. They're not going to have a whole lot of time to make those judgments about you. Giving them a little bit of an introduction and a little bit of a biography about you, that's an easy way to help. But like Steve and Dustin, since you guys are already part of a church in which you probably, when you speak, are going to be speaking to people who you know and you have known for a few years, that relationship that you have with them is going to come through. It's going to aid you in your preaching, and it's also going to let people know that, like, either what you're saying is genuine or not. And as long as you understand that, you can use that to your advantage. So that goes into chapter 3, and that is knowing your audience. And this is all very powerful for you to remember when you get up there to preach, is that everybody in that room is analyzing you. That's what they're doing. They're listening to the message, but a lot of it, they're analyzing you. And they're at a starting point. You know, it's like the bridge, you know, the bridge example that I give. They're over here, and you're wanting to take them over to this side, but you've got to put something. You've got to meet them where they are, not where they should be. And he talks about that. Oftentimes, the preacher has in his mind church issues, evangelism, tithing, church attendance, things like that. Whereas the person in the pew has other concerns. They're worried about health. They're worried about the election. They're worried about their kids and the direction their life is going. They're worried about recent failures or something like that. They're worried about their marriage. And he's saying you need to be aware of your audience. So, so for instance, Steve, you're talking about doing Bible studies at an assisted living. Well, that's great, because one of the things that you've been talking about is how difficult it is for you to connect with your audience because they're in a situation of life that you've never been in, and their ability to respond is very different than the way the average person is able to respond. You can't say, something to them about tithing. All of their money is tied up. They don't have any money to tithe. You can't say anything to them, as you said, about raising children. They don't have children to raise. So understanding them, understanding what's going on in their heart is going to make a big impact. So all of this stuff he talks about then is about like knowing your audience. He says, if you don't understand your audience, page 40, he says, you're kind of like a cook at a soup kitchen dishing up bread and soup to a line of nameless, faceless vagrants who file by. In other words, you don't really care. You're just throwing the food on the plate. You're mass producing it. He says it is as though everything beyond the food containers and serving ladles is a blur. He knows there are people out there, but the cook's problem is not with the eating and the eater, but only with the cooking and the food. A preacher who is so preoccupied with what he will say that he misses thinking about the needs and interests of his audience will probably not deal very well with either. Some of this takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of time. It's the way you think about your audience, and it's the way you engage with your audience. So this yesterday, on Sunday, we had one of our young men preach. And on Wednesday night, we took him into the sanctuary, a couple of us, and we tried to help him work out some of the bugs. And we were trying to teach him how to move away from the pulpit. Now, on Sunday, he didn't actually move away from the pulpit because he was just too nervous. But we tried to get him to move away from the pulpit when he would give an illustration. I said, when you have an illustration, you're going to tell a story, walk over here to the side, and I said, plant your feet and talk to this side of the church. And I said, and when you do, look at them in the eye, and every once in a while, or all the time, use your hands and connect with them. And I said, that will engage them, and that movement gives their eyes something to do rather than just look at the same thing the whole time. And all of this, is to show that you realize that there's an audience out there. If all this was in preaching was just a lecture to transfer information from your brain to their brain, you could just stand up there and read a manuscript. But since that's not what it is, it's a communication. It requires you to engage them through eye contact, through stories, through hand motions, through body language. You're trying to do everything you can to engage on them on a very personal level, to understand where they are, and to hold their attention as best you can throughout the entire message. Because in the end, you're wanting them to do something. The text is wanting them to do something. All right, let's move on. He talks about, being alert to your audience even when you're preparing your sermon too. And on page 42 and 43, he has these, different types of audiences. And you're going to find that, and a lot of times it can be the same audience, it's just the time of the week or the time of the day. He says, part of your job as a preacher is to be kind of a student of people in general. Understand that people are the same all over the world. They can be selfish, they're worried, they're preoccupied, they're stuck in their own heads. And you want to understand what's going on in their heart. So probably the best book on parenting that I've ever read is a book by Ted Tripp called Shepherding a Child's Heart. And what he's saying in that book is that when you're parenting your children, they're going to exhibit behaviors that are going to irritate you. And the temptation for parents is to crack down on the behavior. If you can stop the behavior that you think, then that will keep them out of whatever trouble. And he says, but really what you're doing as a parent is you need to examine what's going on in that child's heart, because the behavior is flowing out of the heart. There's something in that child, something he wants, something that he's afraid of, perhaps an idol in that heart that's causing him to act the way that he is. If you can figure out what that is, what is it he's after? Is he trying to impress a friend? What is he after? Is he afraid of whatever, loss or divorce or something? When you can understand their heart, you can speak directly to what's causing the behavior. When you're preaching, part of what you're trying to do is exactly that. You need to be around your people as much as you can, listening to them, talking to them, so that you understand what their concerns are. And sometimes their concerns are valid, and sometimes their concerns are things that they're concerned about because they're far too influenced by people who are deceiving them. So the news media, social media, these are not good things to have weighing on your mind all the time. But you're going to know how to speak to them at their heart level the more you're around them. So he talks about factors in your demographics, and these things do play a part. A lot of this is you just got to know who you're talking to. He has 6 of those, and then he has 3 factors in psychological profiling. Their attitude, what is their attitude towards you, or their attitudes towards the topic, their beliefs. The reason why this is good is, especially with their beliefs, if your message is trying to challenge their beliefs, if you can articulate their beliefs, it is much easier for you to engage with their beliefs. So, for instance, one of the most commonly held beliefs today is summed up in you only live once. So whether people say they believe it or not, they live as though they do. And so there's a lot of times where teenagers are trying to get the most out of their teenage years because in their mind they only get to be a teenager once, and so they're just trying to live it up. And there's this fear of age and there's fear of death that presides in people that causes them to do things when they're young that they regret later, like party, debauchery, sin. There's things that you do when you're young, not a teenager, but 20s and 30s, in which you spend more than you bring in, going into debt, making decisions about your career that are not smart. These things are just not wise. And behind a lot of that in their heart is this, I've got to get this done, and I've got to experience this while I'm young because I'm not going to get to do this when I'm old. So, if you can articulate that to people, that one of the reasons why, like you're coming in here, you're worried about the fact that you're not making enough money. And you're thinking, how can God give me money, shower me with money, or provide an opportunity for me to make more money? And you can talk about that, you can engage with that, but part of that is you have to back up and say, there's a bigger problem, and that's your spending. Your spending is out of control. Even if you made more money, you're just going to spend. If your spending continues to go up, doesn't matter how much you make. And then why are you spending so much? Well, you can go into their heart. Well, it's because you think that you have to have all of these things while you're young in order to keep up or be a success or to get all of the fun out of life in your 30s that you think you need to have. And people don't realize that. They don't realize, they've never stopped to think about why they're doing a lot of the things that they're doing. And a lot of them are beliefs that they have in their heart that they've never dealt with. It's like they would say, oh, I believe in God, I believe in Jesus, I believe in the Bible, I believe in all of these things. But there's also unexamined beliefs in their hearts that you have to be aware of and articulate to them to show that, for instance, at the very end of John 5, he says, little children, keep yourselves from idols. Well, what's he talking about there? Heart idols. And you have to point out what those heart idols are. Values. So he says, in everybody's heart, there are these competing values. One person values family really, really high on their list. One person values career success very, very high on their list. Career success, good thing to value. Family, good thing to value. A lot of things, it's how you order those things. And a lot of times people will use their values, the thing that they're valuing, to justify failing in another area of life. So, a person can say, well, yeah, I'm in debt up to my eyeballs, but dang it, I'm a good parent. And yeah, they are a good parent, and they're going in debt trying to be a good parent. Or another person says, yeah, I know that I'm not involved in my church as I should be, but I'm trying to do my best for my kids, and I've got them involved in all of these traveling sports or something like that. Well, their value of trying to give their kids the best opportunities is out of balance with other values. And so understanding a lot of those things helps you to understand your audience. Anyway, that's a lot of it. He talks about how a lot of times the man in the pulpit has a certain agenda where the people in the pew have a totally different agenda. You can still have the agenda that you have. You just have to meet people where they are. That's the main thing. If a person in the pew is worried about, he lists some of those on 52, if they're worried about marriage, children, bills, recreation, and you're wanting to talk to them about, church attendance, offerings, outreach, Sunday school, whatever, there's a connection there. You just have to figure out where the overlap is. My text this Sunday is, do not love the world or the things of the world. Well, in order for me to preach that effectively, I have to think deeply about the 200 people who are going to be in front of me, and how are they loving the world? How are they living in the world, and they don't even realize they're loving the world? I'm not going to get up there and talk about dancing or something like that. Nobody in there is concerned about whether or not dancing is a sin. They're worried about all kinds of other things, and a lot of those worries and anxieties come because they're in love with the world, and they don't realize that. So I've got to know my audience. I've got to know who's there. I've got to know what their concerns are. And the more I can understand that, and the more I can engage with what's going on deep there in their heart, the more likely they are going to be able to respond to it. All right. We will, this week, then, we're going to get together Sunday, and I'm going to go over chapters 4, 5, and 6 with you. 4, 5, and 6, the challenge of oral communication, the sound of a voice, and more than words. So we'll go over that Sunday night together. Thanks, guys.